Some names are whispered in fear. Others are spoken only in nightmares. But sometimes there are names that fit into both of these categories. Names like Albert Fish. In the early 1900s, newspapers would call him many things: the Brooklyn Vampire, the Grey Man, the Boogeyman. But long before the world knew his name, before detectives uncovered his horrifying letters, before families wept over what they had lost, Albert Fish was just a boy, innocent, vulnerable, abandoned. But monsters aren't born, they're made. And deep inside the walls of an orphanage, behind locked doors and cold, empty halls, the story of Albert Fish was being written. Albert Fish was born into misfortune. His father was 75 at the time of his birth, old enough to be his great-grandfather. He didn't live long enough to see Albert grow up. One moment he was there, the next gone, a corpse on a street corner. His mother, poor and overwhelmed, made a decision. She sent Albert away, believing she was saving him from starvation. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she wasn't sending him to safety. She was sending him into something far worse. St. John's Orphanage wasn't a refuge. It was a crucible. A place where suffering was the only currency, and the weak were nothing more than playthings for those in power. The punishments were relentless. Boys were beaten with leather straps until their skin split open. They were forced to kneel on rice, coarse salt or corn kernels for hours, their knees battered and bleeding. Cold baths in the dead of winter. Days without food, locked in darkness. And worst of all, they were made to watch as the punishments of their peers were doled out. And Albert Fish did watch. But unlike the others, he didn't just fear the pain. He studied it. He memorized the way the others screamed, how their bodies recoiled, how the nuns smiled as they enforced their twisted version of God's will. At first, Albert cowered. He cried. He feared the punishments just like the rest. But pain can have a way of changing people. Some break under it, others harden, and some learn to love it. Albert was one of the latter. One day he stopped crying. He stopped flinching. The sting of the leather strap became something else entirely. Not a punishment, but a lesson. A feeling he would chase for the rest of his life. Most children left the orphanage carrying scars. Albert Fish left with something far worse. An awakening. By his teenage years, Albert Fish was no longer just another lost soul. He was something else. Something evolving. His mind had become a maze of twisted thoughts, desires he couldn't explain, at least not yet. The Bible became his favourite book, not for salvation but for suffering. Stories of martyrs, of men who whipped and burned their own flesh in the name of God. First he read them, and then he practiced them. One thing that Albert practiced frequently involved sewing needles. He would take them and press them into his thighs. He drove them deeper and deeper, and then watched as his blood beaded at the surface of his skin. The pain sent a shiver down his spine, and as he did this, he understood what he was becoming. The pain wasn't enough. Albert needed something more, something forbidden, something living. By the 1920s, Albert Fish had perfected his disguise. He was small, frail, unthreatening, a soft-spoken gentleman who blended into the background. But beneath that harmless exterior, something unspeakable lurked. His victims. They were the most vulnerable, the forgotten, the ones no one would look for. He would seek out young children, those who were trusting and easy to manipulate. He preyed on families struggling with poverty, offering odd jobs or pretending to be a well-meaning friend. His crimes were so horrific and cannot bring myself to talk about them in detail, but I'll outline them in general. Albert was confirmed to have committed 3 murders, all children, but it's commonly believed that he was responsible for more, far more. As heinous as his murders were, Albert is most notorious for his disturbing letters, which allude to many, many victims, potentially upward of 100 or more. His letters are some of the most disturbing pieces of true crime history, not just because of what they described, but because of the cold, matter-of-fact way he wrote them. His words lacked remorse, instead carrying a sense of gleeful nostalgia, as if he were reliving the events while writing. Despite their horrific content, Fish's letters were written with politeness and formality. He would address parents of his victims with courtesy, even thanking them for their hospitality before describing what had happened. This contrast between his gentle, old-fashioned writing style and the chilling details made them even more disturbing. The letters described the process of luring children into his grasp, often by gaining the trust of their families. The descriptions were not just about what he did, but how he felt during the process, showing a deeply twisted psychological state. He claimed that he was compelled by God to commit his terrible crimes, often referencing biblical figures and martyrdom. They included references to pain and suffering as a form of purification, echoing the harm he inflicted upon himself, claiming that his depraved actions were justified by a higher power. And that may not be the worst of it. Though his letters were not overly explicit, they revealed that he saw consuming flesh as a spiritual experience. He described it with a disturbing detachment, often comparing it to common cooking practices. Some experts believe these parts of his letters may have been exaggerated to gain notoriety, but others argue they were chillingly sincere. Albert Fish's story is more than horror. It is a question, one that lingers long after the case is closed, long after the headlines fade. Was he born evil, or was he created, shaped and moulded by relentless childhood suffering? Could he have been stopped? Could his life have turned out differently? Or was Albert's fate sealed the moment he stepped into that orphanage? What do you think? Was Albert Fish born evil or made into a monster? Please let me know in the comments below. And if this story made you think, please consider liking and subscribing for more explorations into the early lives of some of the world's most notorious killers. Also, check out my other videos on people like Aileen Wuornos, Ed Gein, Peter Curtin, and more. Together we can unravel the mysteries of these dark minds. And remember, behind every monster, there's a story. Until next time.